If you look around today, Western civilization seems, well, on the surface, incredibly successful, right? We're wealthy, technologically advanced. Materially, you could say we've never had it so good. But what if all that success, that material abundance, is actually a symptom, like a side effect of something deeper, a kind of spiritual sickness? What if our whole civilization is fundamentally unwell?
That's a powerful question, and it's exactly the territory we're diving into today. We're looking at a really potent critique of Western materialism, specifically through the lens of René Guénon, the French philosopher.
Yeah, Guénon. And our guide here is basically an analysis drawn from a 2020 book, The Descending Spirituality, a critique of Western materialism and the thought of René Guénon.
Right. And this analysis paints Guénon as someone who saw modern Western culture not as this great achievement, but as, well, deviant, diseased even, lacking a core spiritual essence.
So our mission today is pretty clear, I think. We need to really unpack Guénon's diagnosis. Why did he think the West is sick? And we have to pinpoint this specific historical moment he identifies as the start of the crisis, which is much, much earlier than most people think.
Way earlier.
And then finally, we'll look at his proposed solution for fixing it, which, let's be honest, is often seen as pretty controversial.
Definitely. Guénon offers a completely different way of looking at our modern world. So, yeah, let's get into his framework.
Okay, let's start with the core diagnosis then. Guénon basically puts the blame for the entire Western crisis on one thing: a decisive break from authentic spiritual principles. You know, cutting ties with that metaphysical heritage linked to divine revelation.
Exactly. It's like the modern era just decided to ignore the unseen dimension, the metaphysical realm. Some traditions call it the Kai, but just got sidelined.
And that spiritual break immediately showed up how? In the culture.
Yes, Guénon argued it manifested straight away as this deeply narcissistic cultural attitude. He said Western culture classifies all other civilizations using this really egoistic, hierarchical viewpoint. It's always vertical, us on top, never horizontal, like equals.
So the West isn't just thinking it's advanced, it sees itself as the literal center of everything.
Pretty much, yeah. The West is the pole, the driving force, the center, everyone else. They're just parts sort of revolving around the edge in the margins.
Okay.
And that mindset, naturally, it breeds this assumption of absolute superiority, which then, and this is key, justifies using power, material, and political to force other civilizations onto the same materialist track.
Right, it sounds like a blueprint for cultural imperialism, but dressed up as some kind of historical necessity.
Yeah.
And you mentioned this is reinforced by something Guénon called the classical bias.
That's right, al-Tahayyuz al-Klasiki. This bias acts like a gatekeeper for history. It insists that any real civilization has to trace its roots, its legitimacy, back only to the Greeks and Romans.
Anything else doesn't count.
Basically, yeah. Anything before or anything that developed independently in, say, the East gets dismissed or minimized. It's a mechanism designed purely to keep the story going that the West is the only true heir to civilization.
But hang on, hasn't almost every big civilization had some level of, thinking they're the best? Why is the Western version uniquely dangerous, according to Guénon?
Good question. Because, for Guénon, the Western claim is uniquely rooted in materialism, not metaphysics. And historically speaking, the claim is just, well, shaky. Guénon points out that even some Western scholars admit deep Eastern influences on the Greeks. And you have the historical fact that Muslims were crucial go-betweens for Greek science, preserving and even enriching it with what Guénon called the authentic Eastern spirit. But despite all that, the modern West fiercely clings to this myth that it's the sole pure successor to Greece.
And to keep puffing up this civilizational narcissism, the West constantly needs an enemy, an imaginary one like the Eastern threat.
Al-Sharqi, yeah. Guénon argues the real danger isn't some external threat from the East. It's the West's own internal material nature.
Okay.
And this fixation creates this impossible bind, a logical contradiction, for any non-Western society. Think about it. If you choose to develop materially, you're only seen as successful if you copy the West.
Right.
But if you focus your civilization on anything else, spiritual pursuits, metaphysics, you're immediately labeled decadent, backward, underdeveloped. See the trap. The West's definition of development forces everyone down its own path.
You're forced to play the material game, or you're just dismissed. Wow.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's trace this spiritual collapse itself. I think the role Guénon gives to modern science here is, well, it's really central, isn't it? He argues science didn't just ignore the spiritual, it actively wiped out what was left of it by displacing metaphysics entirely.
Yes, science, in Guénon's critique, effectively became the enemy of the spirit. Why? Because its fundamental rule is, if you can't observe it with the senses or test it empirically, it doesn't count. It's off the table.
So it just refuses to even look.
Pretty much. Modern science, by adopting the self-imposed limit, severed ties with anything transcendent, with the heavenly world as Guénon saw it.
And in his quite dramatic framing, science killed God and then tried to step into that vacant role itself.
Precisely. And when you remove that transcendental center, something has to fill the vacuum, right? So who steps in? The individual human being.
Ah, the cogito.
You got it. It traces right back to Descartes, I think, therefore I am. The individual self becomes the ultimate, undeniable center of reality. And the consequence for Guénon is that the West's huge material success happened precisely because of, and alongside, its accelerating spiritual decay. They went hand in hand.
Guénon is pretty brutal in summing up modern thought. He gives it, what, 3 main characteristics?
Yeah, he boils it down. First, a total absence of real metaphysical knowledge. Second, denying any form of knowledge other than scientific study. And third, arbitrarily limiting even that scientific study to very specific, narrow fields.
It's like we put blinkers on ourselves, limiting what we're even allowed to consider as knowledge.
That's a good way to put it. And this assault on the spiritual, naturally fueled atheism, and this focus on purely humanistic ethics, the conclusion sort of became, okay, humans need ethics, social rules, sure, but they definitely do not need religion in its deeper metaphysical sense.
And he saw historical events, like the Protestant Reformation, as actually making this worse.
He did, yeah. And this is where his views get particularly controversial for many.
Wait, the Reformation. Most people today see that as liberating, right? Democratizing faith, giving individuals direct access.
I know that's the standard narrative, but Guénon saw it very differently. He argued the Reformation deliberately simplified religion. It turned Christianity into this popular mass thing where everyone, the elite and the ordinary person, was expected to understand it equally.
And the problem with that is?
For Guénon, the problem was catastrophic. It meant losing the profound, essential, maybe even esoteric core of the religion. The part that, in his view, genuinely needs a kind of superhuman mind or deep contemplation to really grasp. He wasn't against accessibility per se, but against losing the spiritual depth in the process.
So the deep essence gets sacrificed for, like, popular appeal.
That's his argument. For Guénon, true religion absolutely has to have 3 parts. There's the creed, the rational belief part, the moral law, the social ethical part, and worship, the ritualistic part that connects the other 2. If any one of those is missing or fundamentally weakened, it's just not religion in the true sense of the word anymore.
Okay, so this spiritual sickness runs deep.
But where?
Where did it actually start? We often point fingers at the Enlightenment, maybe the Reformation, like you said.
Right, but this is maybe the most radical piece of Guénon's diagnosis. It's what really sets his thought apart. He traces the beginning of this decline much, much further back.
Further than the Renaissance or Reformation?
Oh, way further. He argues the crisis actually began in the 6th century BCE, the Greek era, before Christianity even existed.
Wow. 2,500 years ago. Why specifically then? What happened?
Because that Greek era, that's when philosophy was born. That's the moment, for Guénon, when logos, rational, logical, human thought triumphed over mythos, sacred, intuitive, revealed knowledge. He sees this elevation of pure human reason, this birth of rationalism, as the original seed of the whole problem. That period marks the beginning of the loss of the ancient sacred doctrines and the start of what the Hindu tradition calls the Dark Age, the Kali Yuga. That's the real root deep down of the West's decay, according to him.
Okay, so if the disease is that old, 2,500 years, and it's been accelerating, what's the prognosis now? Where does Guénon see the West today?
Well, he believed Western civilization is in the final phase of its cycle. Think of it like the Chaldean cycle, birth, maturity, then decadence. Guénon saw the West as being in its old age right before the annihilation of this particular civilizational period.
Annihilation? That sounds pretty final.
It does, but it's crucial to understand. He's talking about the end of the Western cycle, this specific historical phase, not the literal end of the entire world.
Okay, that's an important distinction.
Yes. And he also states clearly that this decay isn't necessarily absolute or irreversible. It can theoretically be fixed or repaired. But it requires a really radical internal shift away from the current trajectory.
And that shift means reconnecting with what was lost, with tradition. But we need his specific definition here, right?
Yeah.
Because he doesn't just mean like singing Christmas carols or
Nothing.
keeping old customs.
No, not at all. He's incredibly precise about this. For Guénon, tradition with a capital T means superhuman knowledge. Marifa fawq bashariya. It has to be knowledge connected to divine revelation, something beyond human invention.
So things we normally call traditions, philosophical traditions, scientific methods, artistic movements, those don't count.
Not as tradition in his specific sense, no. Those are purely human constructs. They lack that connection to the superhuman source.
Right. So the chaos and fragmentation we see in the West,
Yeah.
the endless analysis, the breakdown of meaning, that's the direct result of chasing purely human material knowledge, focusing on quantity over quality.
Exactly. It's analysis running wild without the balancing force of synthesis, which comes from those higher principles found in tradition.
Okay, let's get to the solution then, because it sounds like it's going to be as radical as the diagnosis. Guénon says the West has to return to the true path, restore the religious and metaphysical dimension. But he doesn't think the West can do this alone.
No, that's the kicker. Guénon argues, quite pointedly, that the West will need the aid of the East to rediscover and reawaken its own lost traditions.
Whoa! Aid from the East.
Yes. He believed that the East, even though it was suffering from what he called a temporary spiritual contraction, partly due to Western influence, ironically still held on to the essential spiritual heritage, the connection to tradition, that the West had almost completely severed.
So, an Eastern lifeline. Our material success story ultimately depends on spiritual help from elsewhere. That completely flips the usual modern narrative of global power, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It turns the whole thing on its head. And for this spiritual renewal to actually happen, Guénon said it requires a dual approach. You need both contemplation, which connects you to the principles, the highest spiritual truths, and action, which relates to the variables, the application in the earthly realm.
You need the insight to guide the action.
Precisely. The spiritual understanding has to inform and direct the material efforts. Otherwise, you just repeat the same mistakes.
Okay, so let's try and synthesize this whole deep dive. Guénon's argument, in essence, is that the West's amazing material achievements came at a terrible price. Spiritual amputation. A crisis rooted way back in ancient Greece when we chose human reason, logos, over sacred knowledge, mythos.
Right, 6th century BCE.
And the only way back, the only fix, is a radical U-turn towards that superhuman spiritual knowledge, towards tradition. And potentially, we need help from the East, which has managed to hold on to that connection better than we have.
That's a good summary. And the real tragedy, as Guénon saw it developing even in his time, was that the West's material focus, its chaos, was already spreading globally. He saw educated people in Eastern societies becoming convinced that the only path forward was to mimic the West, to adopt its materialism.
Thereby cutting off their own roots and just speeding up the global spiritual decline.
Exactly. It's a sobering thought.
It really is. And it makes his distinction quite stark, differentiating between the end of the world in some apocalyptic sense and the imminent end of a part of the world, meaning this specific Western civilizational cycle.
And if you take Guénon's analysis seriously, even just as a thought experiment, it suggests that maybe our current age, with all its feelings of nihilism, fragmentation, absurdity, isn't unprecedented chaos. Maybe it's just the predictable final phase of a very long human time cycle that kicked off thousands of years ago when we first prioritized human reason above all else.
Which leaves us with a pretty challenging question to ponder, doesn't it?
It does. It asks you, the listener, in your own life, in your own pursuit of what we call modern progress, what essential timeless principles Guénon might link to tradition could you be overlooking or undervaluing right now? Something to think about.